of course, went to Mexico, her and her husband, and actually it was the Ganza Mishpucha, the whole family went. And they went down there and shared a lot of gifts that you all sent. Clothing, money, used money for the clothes center. So we'd like to get some sort of an update. Now, if you want a fuller one, let me know. Maybe we can schedule a Wednesday night or something like that for that. Would that be all right? But if you could give us maybe 10 minutes or so, and if that's okay, can you do that? Thank you very much. You don't want to take all my time now, do you? Okay.
Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank everyone for your support and your help and in all the ways that everyone did. It seemed like everything came together like 4 days before we left. And it just always amazes me how faithful God is in that. He's not early, he's not late, he's right on time, and just builds our faith every time that we see everything come together just at the very last moments like that. This particular orphanage that we work at, I try to go 3 or 4 times a year, and this time was really extra special because, like Aaron mentioned, our whole family got to go, my kids, and we have a 11-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a 7-year-old, and just getting to see them serve God and learn and grow in their faith and in their serving, that makes a very special trip for us. So anyway, we flew to Phoenix, Arizona, and that's where we always kind of drive to Mexico from, and we meet up with my brother and my sister-in-law when we get out there. And the first night that we got to Phoenix, my brother and sister-in-law, they asked my kids, what would you like to do that would be special for you? And their answer was kind of funny to my brother and sister-in-law. They said, we'd like to eat ice cream outside, because it's December, and in Kentucky it's too cold to eat ice cream outside in December. So everybody kind of had a chuckle about that, and we ended up going to this place. I would assume it's something kind of like 4th Street downtown, 4th Street Live, a real happening place with music and little shops and things like that. And the kids were having a great time eating their ice cream, and they were playing with their cousins who they don't get to see very often. And I was sitting with my brother and my brother-in-law and my sister-in-law talking, and all of a sudden, my niece came up to me, who's the same age as little Benjamin, 7 years old, and she said, Benjamin's not playing with me anymore. He's gone. I can't find him. And I just kind of chuckled at it, and I'm like, oh, he's probably with his brothers, boys. And I just kept on talking to my sister-in-law, and a couple minutes later, I started getting just kind of this nagging, sick-to-my-stomach feeling. And I happened to look over, and I saw his older brothers were sitting talking with some of their cousins, and I got to looking, and I couldn't find Benjamin. And I didn't panic. It was really loud music, happening place. It was really busy. I didn't panic. I just figured he's around that palm tree over there, or he's around that corner over there. But I got everyone up kind of looking. And so there were 9 of us kind of going around the perimeter of this place, and we all converged on the place where we just knew Benjamin would be, the candy shop. Because you know how kids are when it comes to candy, and there was this great big candy shop there. And Alan went in the candy shop and was looking around, and just knew we'd find him there. But when Alan came out and Benjamin wasn't in the candy shop, I hadn't panicked up to that point. But when that happened, I got this really, really sinking feeling to my stomach, and the thought crossed my mind, I might not ever see Benjamin again. He might be really, really gone. And I'd like to say that the peace that passes understanding guarded my heart and my mind, and I stayed calm. I became crazy woman. I became crazy woman looking for my little Benjamin. And thankfully, Alan did find him a few minutes later. He had wandered down just kind of an outside corridor. But that was how our trip started. And that really, really shook us up and got us thinking. So, several days later, we go to the orphanage, and, we're with these kids, and I realized how much my heart just was wrenched at the thought, at the very thought that I may never see my son Benjamin again. And these children at the orphanage, they don't have a mom or a dad or anyone that's really thinking about them in that way, but they have a heavenly Father that loves them that much and that will do whatever it takes. I had the passing thought that maybe my son's lost forever. Maybe I won't see my child again. But God didn't have that passing thought. God knew that we were eternally separated from him. So what a privilege it was to go at this season and share God's love with these kids, and how God made a way for them to be with him forever, and to love on them that way. We took them the gifts that you guys had given us to take to them, and it was just such a beautiful, exciting thing to watch them open their presents. And we take tags off of our presents whenever we give gifts. We take the price tag off of them. But what we reminded them of was that, God, he didn't take the price tag off. He wants us to understand the cost of his gift, of his son. He didn't take the price tag off of that. He wants us to know just how much it cost him and just how much he loves us. And so it was such a privilege to go to these children and to be God's hands and feet and show his love through these gifts. And we filled up their pantry with a lot of food, and we had a special meal for them. And it's sometimes not the big things like the presents and things like that. Sometimes it's just holding their hand. I have one little girl that every time I'm there, she just holds my hand so tightly, and her name is Sarita, and she's very precious to me, and I have to remind myself that I can't bring her home. My husband and I, we go to orphanages all over the world, and you fall in love with certain kids, just kind of get to you, and you can't bring them home. You can't bring them all home, but I have to remind myself that God loves those children just as much as I love Benjamin. And just like my heart was just wrenched at the thought of him being lost or missing, that God is caring for them in a much more perfect way than I can even care for my Benjamin. And he's watching out for them in a much more perfect way than I even watch out for my Benjamin. So, again, I just want to thank everyone for your help and your support. The kids, it was just amazing to see their faces. And also, I just want to say we had an opportunity for the first time to kind of reach out into the community around. I had no idea how poor the community was in this part of Mexico. You're literally just a few miles from the border. I mean, you can see the United States from this town, and just the poverty there. We went into an area where they had no electricity, no running water, families living with just no more than a cardboard box to keep them off the ground. And so we were able to take some food supplies and just get out in the community, and we're asking for prayers just to help us know really how to reach that community in a better, more effective way. So thank you.
Do you have any pictures? Could you make up a book or something that we could take a look at the kids? That'd be great. Thank you very much. Okay, today's parashat is from Vayechi, and he lived, Genesis 47, verse 28, 47:28 through 50:26. So, quite frankly, this is kind of a continuation of what we talked about last week. It's kind of like part B of part A. And so I want to turn to that and discuss some things with you as we move through the day. I really think we already had a pretty good time, but I want to talk about a few things. Now, this is really the end of Jacob's life. And he was 147 years old, the scriptures tell us. The time came when Israel was approaching death, so he called for his son Yosef and told him, "If you truly love me, please put your hand under my thigh and pledge that out of consideration for me, you will not bury me in Egypt. Rather, when I sleep with my fathers, you are to carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they are buried." He replied, "I will do as you have said," he said. "Swear it to me." And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed down at the head of his bed. Promises are very important. We've got to be real careful with our promises. At the end of this year, of course, we live in a secular world here in the United States, and apart from the Jewish calendar that we're very familiar with, we also are governed by this Julian calendar. A Julian calendar. And some of us are probably very glad for the Julian calendar because I got a lot of time off. We didn't have to work. I saved some vacation days and turned about 2 4-day weekends into about 10 days off. So I like that. But and then we have fiscal years and years that we measure funds and finances and things like that. So at the end of this year, we all know, bingo, that's all the income that we can be taxed on, whatever we put in. are made January 1st through December 31st. And by the way, if you want to give a donation, you still have time to get something in for this year's tax. Although I always caution people, the Lord did not come to give you a deduction. You give because you feel constrained by God to give back to Him a little bit of what He's given to you, not for the deduction. I'm not encouraging people that they can have massive deductions and lower their tax burden dramatically by blessing grace and themselves. It doesn't work like that. I remember one time there was a guy in a Messianic congregation in Florida, and he, they preached on tithing and how you can bring the tithes into the storehouse and I'll bless you with overflowing abundance, etc. And the preacher taught on that, and then the guy eventually kept giving money, and tithing and everything, and then he didn't see the return on his investment. We talk about ROI in the business world, return on investment, and he sued the congregation because the promise wasn't working. It's not like that, folks. It just doesn't work like that. And in the same sense, as I said earlier, the Lord didn't come for a deduction. He came for you, for salvation, for redemption, for a way of providing forgiveness for you and a whole life. But at any rate, back in those days, they made people put their hand on their thigh. I don't really understand. I'm sure there's some book somewhere that'll explain to you how important it is when you put someone's hand under your thigh, that really means you're going to keep that promise. Because I got news for you, people break promises left and right. And as we move towards this January 1st and December 31st, there's all kinds of people going to make lots of promises. Well, I'll never do that again. You ever made that promise to yourself? I'll never do that again. And there are some of those promises I was able to keep. Because I was so sick one time, I said, I'll never do that again. And I never did, because I didn't like being sick like that. But we won't talk about what it was I did. Okay, that was a long time ago, and I was in the military, and I was overseas, and I was not a believer. And I said, never again. Never. But there's a lot of other things that I say never again to that I still do. You get to that point in life, and you think, or that point in time, you say, oh, come on, I can do this. Like diets. Everybody has diets, and we have Weight Watchers, and now they've got something. Oh, the best thing in the world. I don't know what this stuff's called, I forget, but you can sprinkle it on your food and it helps you lose weight. I mean, hey, I can eat and lose weight. That'd be a great idea. Have you seen those commercials yet? I mean, everybody likes that. Or all you got to do is take a pill and everything melts off, or your body won't absorb this certain amount of fat. Of course, they don't tell you about the other side effects of that stuff, but the point is there ain't no easy way for doing these things. And keeping a promise is a very important thing. So don't make promises that you don't think you can keep or you can't keep. And for sure, we don't want to make promises to our friends and not keep them if at all possible. But then on the other side of the spectrum is the promisee, the guy that gets the promise. There's the promiser, and then there's the promisee. And don't be disappointed when they're not kept. Don't be so disappointed when they're not kept, because guys, if I've learned anything from the Word of God, you can't depend on people. If I've learned anything from my life, you can't depend on people. I've been lied to, and I've made promises that I've broken to people, but I've been lied to. I've had people tell me, boom, you're the next one out. You're this, you're that, and it doesn't happen because something else just kind of gets in the way, especially if time passes by. And then we get a little farther on, and we see that, here, actually, let me stop right there. I was going to wait till that. You see what this is? You don't know this. This is a promise, but it ain't the promise that was given. I loved my uncle dearly, and my mother's brother. And he was a career Marine, and he became a believer, and we went and visited him, and he had gotten out of the Marine Corps. And he was actually going to a Bible college, and I went. He took me out to his car, and he took out from under the seat of his car this really neat-looking thing. It was called a machete. Anybody here know what a machete is? Well, to an 8-year-old boy, a machete is a pretty cool thing. Especially it had this big leather sheath to it. And he says, "Now, when you're 16, I'm going to give this to you." He said, when you're 16, I'm going to give this to you. Well, I never didn't get to see him when I was 16. My parents got divorced, and the family kind of got all broken up, and I did see him much later, but I didn't say anything. But I'll tell you what I carried around in the back of my mind all the time was that machete and that promise. And I was expecting him to keep that promise. I thought, boy, if anybody's going to keep a promise, it's Uncle Jim. He doesn't make them lightly. He looks at you so sincerely when he said this. When you're 16, I'm going to give this to you. You're too young now. And I thought, wow. So never saw the machete. One day I finally got up the nerve. I guess I was about 22 at the time. And I went to visit him. I said, Uncle Jim, where's that machete? And he looked at me and he thought, my goodness, he remembered the promise. See, they probably thought I'd forget. Kids don't forget those kinds of things. Not when there's a really neat machete attached to it. I mean, anybody ever seen a knife that's just a big knife like this? I mean, wow, that was really great. He'd given it to his stepson. He had remarried, and his wife had a son. I guess he adopted him, actually. He adopted this boy, and then gave him the machete when he turned 16. And I thought, oh, my promise wasn't kept. And I didn't think I really was going to see it, to be honest with you, by that time. And I wasn't that disappointed, quite frankly, because promises, they're made to be broken, I guess. They're just made to be broken. And I looked at Uncle Jim and I said, well, it's okay, don't worry about it, I forgive you. It's not that big a deal. And he really felt bad, and we were in his store a couple of years later, and he reached up and he gave me this. Now this, if you don't know what it is, this is first of all, it's a very expensive leather case. And in it has a really expensive fish, well, it's for cleaning fish, this knife. I mean, it's got a great blade, it bends, around, so it'll bend around things. It's got a beautiful rosewood handle, and it's what's the knife? It's a case, by the way. It's not a cheap knife. If anybody here knows knives, I bet I could take this over to the fairground today and get a bunch of money for it. Okay, I've never seen one like it. I'm sure they're out there, but I've never seen one like it. But that can be what a promise looks like, but guess what? That promise doesn't look like the promise that was made. Not even close. That sucker was this big. And it was cool. And I don't use this. I'm not a fisherman, My wife likes to fish, but she just likes to sit there. I want to catch something. Anybody, the people that really like to fish, they don't really even care if they catch fish. They just like to sit there and do that. I'm thinking, I want to catch something, take it home and eat it. That's what fishing's for. Of course, some of the stuff I've pulled out of the water doesn't look worth eating. But the point is, don't be so upset with people that don't keep their promises. But I can tell you somebody that does keep their promises. Now, who is that? You can say it out loud if you'd like. That's right. God keeps his promises. The Lord keeps every promise he makes. And I think sometimes we're so overwhelmed with the world that we don't even consider all the promises that he's given us. I know I've been in people's houses where they have these little Post-it note things, and it's sitting there, and every day they open up and there's a promise in there right before they have breakfast. And I thought, I don't know, do they really take those promises seriously? Do you take those promises seriously when you see what's going on in the world today? They can't get this. We're going to all go over the financial cliff, and Syria is a mess, and Egypt's a mess. And I mean, my goodness, they're considering giving F-16s and Abrams tanks to the Egyptians. What are we doing in this country? But you know what? God has made promises to keep us. He said that, lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of this age, he's with us. So why are we worried? I heard one preacher say one time, and I think I've told you this before, worry is a sin. Worry is a sin because worry shows a great lack of trust in God. And that's really what we're talking about today, is trusting in him. Worry is a down payment on a debt you may never owe. How about that? That's pretty good too. I heard D. James Kennedy say that. Never forgot it, because it's true. People sit there and they worry, and they let that worry eat their insides away. Some people have ulcers because they're such great worriers. Some people are better worriers than other people are. But the point is that they let it eat at them, and then whatever it is they're worrying about never even happens. Do you trust God? And you know something else? Sometimes those promises that God makes to us, when we read them and we're familiar with them and we see them taking place, we don't understand them. Duh. We don't understand them. And we think, well, God didn't really mean that because I, with my unique intelligence and spirituality, don't understand this. Because if you go moving along a little farther, Jacob calls for Joseph to bring his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, to him. And he wants to bless them. First, he gives the double portion to Joseph. Joseph literally is the one that is to be the big inheritor of whatever it is that Jacob's leaving behind. Not Reuben. Reuben lost his place. Simeon lost his place. Levi lost their places. Joseph, who's way down the line, was to be the chief inheritor of whatever it is Jacob was to leave behind. He received the double portion. He was the most important of all the sons. Did we ever see that before? Did we ever see that before? Anybody here? Remember, what do we call that? Joseph in the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat? Remember when he had the dream? And what did he see? He saw all the sheaves bowing down what? Before him. So this thing came to pass. This was actually a dream from God. I don't know that he handled it properly. But the point is, it was a promise that God made. God keeps all his promises. But at any rate, he brings in Manasseh, he brings in Ephraim. He wants his sons to be blessed because that's what Jacob had called for. Because he said, hey, you know, your two sons, they're going to be inheritors just like your brothers. They're taking Reuben's place, literally. They're taking Levi's place. They're taking these men's places because they have not done well according to their actions and the way they live their lives. They were to be equal inheritors. His sons were actually elevated above their other first cousins to the status of their uncles. But Joseph, just like the rest of us, you know, you take that firstborn and he guides the firstborn over to the right hand of his father, which is the right hand is that hand of blessing. And then he takes the youngest and he moves him over to the left hand because that's the proper order. And we all think that's right and we understand that. How many people here have kids? I bet you remember more about your first one than you do about any of the others. You know, I remember when Jessica was born. Now, she's number 2. We love Jessica every bit as much as we love Rebecca, but you just remember more about that first one because you struggle a lot more with that first one. Okay? You know, by the time I had a friend of mine, he said, boy, when the first one, the first one needed a bottle, he'd get up at night because he didn't have the blessing that I had. Because everything was ready for me. You know, I just had to bring the baby to Judy and could go right to sleep. But this guy had to heat the milk up and everything. And if he dropped the bottle, his back, and he had to do it all over again. Well, he said by the time they got to the 4th kid, if he dropped the bottle, he took it, he wiped it on his shirt, stuck it in her mouth. See, things you get more used to things. Things are different with it 1, 2, 3, and 4, or even 1 and 2. Jessica looked in the pictures one time, and we had more pictures of Rebecca in the hospital than we had of Jessica. And she looked at us, and she said, I must be adopted. That's what she thought. Now, she just said that because she's real smart. But the point is that first she thought, well, I must be adopted. And nothing could be farther from the truth, you know. I used to call her my number 1, number 2, but she didn't like being number 2. Nobody likes being number 2. We're number 2. We're number 2. You ever heard anybody cheer for that? But anyway, you know, Joseph understood this was the way of things. This is my eldest here, and I want him blessed, Manasseh, and I love Ephraim, but Manasseh's number 1. He came first. But not so as far as Jacob was concerned. Jacob says, no, and he moved and put his right hand on Ephraim and his left hand on Manasseh and blessed them both accordingly. And Jacob was a little upset. But you know, he didn't change anything. If you remember the previous generations, remember Jacob and Esau? God gave a promise. And he said the younger will serve the elder. But mom still had to get her 2 cents in and finagle. And look at all the tragedy that produced, and all the hassle that produced, and all the service that did between Esau and Jacob. Esau was so upset. Remember, Esau, this was the one that was able to sell his birthright for a bowl of lentils, but he didn't take it all that seriously. But when he lost his blessing, he was ready to kill his brother. This is what you call a dysfunctional family nowadays, you know. I don't know about that dysfunctional stuff. I remember my sister-in-law was telling me about this. She's got a master's degree in social counseling, and she's really pretty smart about all that. But she told me, you've got to read this book. It just explains everything in your family, dysfunctional families, you know, because we have a dysfunctional family. My dad and my mom and my brothers and I looked at it and I started reading the book and I thought to myself, I sat back and I thought, whatever happened to just plain old sin? Plain old disobedience to God, plain old rebellion to His will and His plan. Whatever happened to that? That's really what it's all about. Now, I can understand that there are reasons for putting labels on these things and understanding a little more, and it does help. It does give some insight into the behavior of people. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying there's anything. Look, it's just like when you go and need work on your engine, you go to a mechanic because he understands it. You can pray for it, but you know the mechanic still is the one that's trained to fix it. And in the same sense that psychologists, psychiatrists, well, they probably have a place too. But if you take God out of the mix, you're going to have a real problem. So at any rate, I'm looking at poor Joseph, and he's saying, oh my goodness, you know, he did it the wrong way. That's not the way I want it. That's not the way I understand things. And if there's anybody that by now should have understood that things as they look aren't always what they seem. Remember what we talked about last week? What did Joseph say? Brothers, he said, don't be upset. He said, God meant all this that happened to me for good, so that I could bless my family, so that I could save my family. And in the same sense, God understands and knows what He's doing when He makes His blessings. Now, I don't want to get into all the history that surrounds Ephraim and Manasseh, but I do know this. If God wants to work that way through Jacob, let Him do it. Sometimes even a spiritual man like Joseph, a spiritual man, a man that really knew God and really loved and served God, still has misunderstandings about what God wants to do and can still be a little upset. And I know that it's going to happen to each one of us every once in a while. God will want to do something in our lives and say, why in the world are you doing that? Why don't we just instead take off that fleshly understanding and the minds that we have and use the mind that God gave us and use the eyes and the sight that God gives us and look and see for the spiritual things behind everything that takes place in our life. Because there's a spiritual side to everything. Remember, we've talked about that before. When you're confronted with certain situations, look for the spiritual in it. Now, I'm not telling you to be totally stupid. I mean, gravity's still gravity. You know, you don't approach the cliff and just jump off. Even the Lord said, thou shalt not tempt the Lord. Now, we know that He wants you to have a prosperous life, but that doesn't mean you tempt Him. Okay, God, you're going to save me. I'm jumping off the cliff. I don't think that's the way it works. But if you move through your life in a manner that is pleasing to God, and everybody says, well, what's that? What does that mean? Or how is that? Well, pick this up. I can't tell you everything. I'm still learning. But He talks to you about those things. Whatever, the Apostle Paul, Rav Shaul writes, whatever things are pure, whatever things are just, and he goes on and he gives you an outline of what to do and what's considered to be important, and he says, live on those things. Live on the holy things of God. Live on the righteous things of God. And you'll know His truth. And you'll know His promises are true. And you'll look to see and understand what it is He has in mind for you when certain things happen in your life. Because I'll tell you, there are things that are going to happen in this coming year, 2013, that you're going to sit there and you're going to go, what was that all about? Well, it's just going to happen. Now, a lot of times you'll react like me and you just want to yell and shout and jump, run around and act like an idiot and do stupid things. You know, and I'll do that. I'll be the first to admit to you that I can fly off the handle real quick sometimes in certain areas, and certain things happen to certain people in my sphere of influence. You know, sometimes my first reaction is defense, I want to defend that person, or I want to just get mad at them because they don't understand as well as I do, which everybody should really understand as well as I do, right? It doesn't always. I'm getting a laugh over here. But it just doesn't work that way. Let's look to God and see what He wants. Maybe that counting to 10. Remember, count to 10 first. My mother used to tell me, count to 10. Maybe that count, or she'd say take 10 deep breaths. Of course, what I found out at the end of 10 deep breaths is I was going to pass out. Maybe that's what she wanted, because then I wouldn't be able to really say anything. Boom, Aaron's out. Oh, okay. But, count to 10. And while you're counting to 10, ask God to show you what is in there. Because Joseph, he didn't agree with what his father did. And he said, no, you got it wrong. This is the eldest. And Jacob looked and says, look, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. This is the way I see it. Jacob backed off and said, okay, Pop. Okay, let's see what God's going to do with this. That's the way we should work. That's the way we should handle this. Our lives are not wrapped up in who we are. Our lives are wrapped up in who He is and what He wants to do with us and where He wants to lead us and where He wants to guide us and what He wants us to accomplish for Him. There's nothing wrong with that. How did Paul, when he started all of his letters, he said he was a servant of the Most High God. Now, actually, what he said was he was a slave to the Most High God. He was a slave. That means God owned him. God told him what to do, and he had to comply. But what was the best thing about it is he wanted to. He wanted to. The Lord said, you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. You see, only with the eyes of that God gives you can you see that one who is a slave can truly be free. That's the freest, as a slave to God of Israel. That's the freest any of us shall ever be, is to be a slave to God. And the world's going to look at you and they're going to say, you are nuts. You're nuts. But I don't really care what the world thinks, and we have to remember that. When we stand in front of God and He asks us why we did this, are we going to say it's because Joe Blow made me do that? Because he's not interested in Joe Blow. Joe Blow's got his own problems when he stands before God. He's interested in you. How did you react? Were you listening to me? I sent someone to talk to you about this and to plead with you to do the right thing if you made a mistake. And there'll be other times when you did the right thing and God will say, well done, thou good and faithful servant. You did good. Of course, He's the one that told you what to do. He's the one that showed you how to do it. He's the one that gave you the energy to do it. He's the one that gave you the grace to do it and the strength to do it and the wherewithal to do it. But He's going to tell you, well done, thou good and faithful servant. And I look here and I watch Joseph and I thought to myself, it kind of was disconcerting the first time I read that he disagreed with something his father said. But he didn't make an issue out of it, did he? I'll tell you, I know families that I've been in that they disagree with something the dad does, and that's it. We're not talking forever again. You think that happens? Or they'll just sit there and they'll all be reminiscing and say, but I'll never forget the time he did that wrong. Well, then he didn't forgive, did he? Because forgiving is forgetting. You deal with things the way God wants you to deal with them, not the way you think is best. And I think you'll always come out right. You'll always come out right. So let's look here at the New Covenant, and we'll turn to the book of Messianic Jews, or Hebrews, however you have it in your particular translation. And we're going to go to chapter 11. Chapter 11, and we're going to start with 21 as we finish. By trusting, Yaakov, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons, leaning on his walking stick as he bowed in prayer. He was doing what God wanted him to do. He was trusting God that he was being used in this blessing and the way he had to do it and the decisions that he had made, even though Joseph didn't agree. by trusting, Yosef, near the end of his life, remembered about the exodus of the people of Israel and gave instructions about what to do with his bones. So in other words, boy, that Yosef, he had taken care of his father. He buried him where he was supposed to bury him. By the way, I think y'all should look at this sometime. He was buried with Leah, not with Rachel. He was buried with Leah, the first wife. Wasn't supposedly be the wife that he didn't love as much, but that's the wife he was buried with. That's for free, by the way. And then Joseph, as he's dying, says, okay, now you're going to take my bones back to Israel, to the land of Canaan. You're going to bury me there with our forefathers there. That's where I want to be buried. You're going to take me back. And you know that didn't happen for how many years? 400 years. How old is the United States? 40 years old? Well, if you take 1776 as the birth of the nation, that would be 200 years to 1976, and then another 24, and then another 36. So that's 236 years. That's nothing. 400 years they labored under Pharaoh because, eventually there was a Pharaoh who rose up in Egypt who knew not Joseph in the King James English. And things got pretty bad. But Yosef knew they were going back. He knew this was a temporary address. And 400 years doesn't sound very temporary, does it? But it was. And as soon as they started moving, they knew it was a temporary address. Of course, a lot of them wanted to go back. But Yosef, he had that faith. He knew this won't make sense. 400 years doesn't look temporary to me, but it is temporary. 2,000 years doesn't look temporary, does it? No, it looks pretty permanent. I know I talk to people about the Lord and they say, oh, that all happened 2,000 years ago or whatever. And that testimony was 2,000 years ago. It's over with, it's done. Well, no, it's not. Not in God's mind. And I got news for you. When you hear the trump, I don't care whether you're in the ground or above, when you hear that shofar sound, it won't seem very permanent at that time, will it? It sure will mean that this was a temporary address to you. Because we're trusting. We're trusting by trusting the parents of Moshe hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw that he was a beautiful child and they weren't afraid of the king's decree. They trusted God. By trusting, Moshe, after he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose being mistreated along with God's people rather than enjoying the pleasures of sin. He had come to regard abuse suffered on behalf of the Messiah as greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he kept his eyes fixed on the reward. Now, from a worldly standpoint, Moses made a very bad decision. He probably had a wonderful 401k and pension plan and profit sharing plan under Pharaoh, didn't he? But he said, nope, that's not what I want. I want what God wants for me. I'm trusting God. I'm trusting God for my life. I'm trusting God for my direction in life. I'm looking at him. Do you think maybe for 1 minute he thought, maybe I shouldn't do this? I'll bet you he did. He's just human like the rest of us. It's just a good thing they didn't want to write about that. Of course, he was one writing the book. But we do see some times where he did have a lack of faith. We do see that later on. He was perfectly willing to talk about his mistakes as well. But I'll bet you when he thought, he probably liked Pharaoh. Pharaoh liked him. At least it looked like that's the way it looked in the movie. Ben-Hur had a girlfriend too, or not Ben-Hur. I mean, he was Ben-Hur later. But I think I'm going to have to reboot again. But Moses he had a girlfriend there, and I mean everything looked pretty rosy, and he said no. And he went looking in places that some people say, well, it's not really a very good place to find a young lady to marry for a guy who is a son of Pharaoh. But you see, he didn't think that way. He wanted God involved in his decision making eventually, and that's what he chose, was the God path. By trusting, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered as one who sees the unseen. By trusting, he obeyed the requirements of the Pesach, including the smearing of the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By trusting, they walked through the Red Sea as though dry land, and when the Egyptians tried to do it, the sea swallowed them up. That, by the way, is the definition of chutzpah. Anybody who ever wants you to ask what chutzpah is, it's those Egyptians riding down into the Red Sea after they just seen all the children of Israel walk through, and they knew God did that. But somehow or another, somebody convinced them, nah, that's just some natural happening, and it ain't gonna. You don't have any problems. That's not how it worked out, folks, is it? That's not how it worked out.